The train wheezed to a stop at Mercy's Bend station, spitting black smoke into the October sky. Clara Whitmore pressed her face against the dusty window, searching the platform for a man she'd never met, a man who'd promised her a new life through letters and a paid ticket west. The conductor's voice rang out, "Mercy's Bend! All passengers for Mercy's Bend!" Clara gathered her worn carpetbag and smoothed her traveling dress. The blue cotton faded from too many washings back in Ohio. Her hands trembled as she adjusted the small cameo at her throat. Her mother's, the only thing of value she still owned. She'd sold everything else to buy provisions for this journey, trusting in the promises of one Samuel Morrison, rancher, who'd advertised for a bride in the Eastern papers. The platform was a chaos of movement. Cowboys lounged against the depot wall, their eyes following her descent from the train car. Merchants hawked their wares. A few proper ladies in crisp bonnets hurried past, clutching their children close, but no one stepped forward to claim her. No one called her name. Clara stood beside her trunk as the train pulled away, its whistle a mournful cry that echoed her growing dread. The Arizona sun beat down mercilessly, nothing like the gentle warmth of Ohio autumns. Red dust swirled around her boots, settling into the folds of her dress. "You waiting on someone, miss?" A station clerk approached, his face weathered as old leather. "Yes, Mr. Samuel Morrison. He was to meet me. I'm his intended bride." The clerk scratched his graying beard. "Morrison? Don't know no Morrison round these parts. You sure you got the right town?" Clara's heart sank. She pulled the crumpled telegram from her pocket. "Mercy's Bend, Arizona Territory, October 15th. Well, that's today and this is Mercy's Bend, but ain't no Morrison I ever heard of." He glanced at her trunk. "You got somewhere to stay?" Mr. Morrison was to arrange. Might try the Imperial Hotel. Mrs. Duluth runs a decent establishment." He tipped his hat and returned to his duties, leaving Clara alone among strangers. The town stretched before her, a single muddy street lined with false front buildings. The Imperial Hotel stood 3 buildings down, its painted sign already peeling in the desert heat. Clara hefted her carpetbag and attempted to drag her trunk, but the weight proved too much for her travel-weary arms. "Need help with that, pretty lady?" A cowboy separated from the group by the wall, his grin revealing tobacco-stained teeth. "Happy to carry it wherever you're going. Maybe buy you a drink after?" "No, thank you." Clara straightened her spine, though fear crept along her nerves. "Oh, don't be like that. Man offers help. Least you could do is be friendly." He reached for her trunk, but Clara stepped between him and her belonging. "I said no." His companions laughed. "Leave her be. Jake. Can't you see she's quality? Too good for the likes of us." "Quality?" Jake spat tobacco juice dangerously close to her hem. "Quality women don't come out here alone. Less they're looking for something." Clara's cheeks burned, but she held her ground until the men grew bored and wandered toward the saloon. Only then did she manage to drag her trunk to the hotel, arriving disheveled and exhausted. The lobby was dim and stuffy. A woman with steel-gray hair and suspicious eyes looked up from her ledger. "I need a room, please. I'm Clara Whitmore. Mr. Samuel Morrison was to—" "Never heard of him?" Mrs. Duluth's lips pursed. "Rooms are $2 a night, in advance." Clara's hand went to her purse. She had exactly $3.40 to her name, expecting Samuel to provide for her needs upon arrival. Might there be work available? I can cook and sew. This ain't a charity house. You got money or not? One night, then." Clara counted out the coins with shaking fingers. Mrs. Duluth assigned her a small room at the back, overlooking the stable yard. Clara sat on the narrow bed, fighting tears. How could she have been so foolish? Trading letters with a stranger, believing his promises, traveling across the country to marry a man who didn't exist, or worse, who'd simply changed his mind. As darkness fell, she ventured downstairs to inquire about work, but Mrs. Duluth had gone out. In the dining room, several male guests eyed her with interest that made her retreat quickly to her room. She went to bed hungry rather than risk their attention, The night brought little rest. Shouts from the saloon filtered through thin walls. Horses stamped in the stable yard. When dawn finally came, Clara packed her few belongings and went to settle her account, only to find her remaining money wouldn't cover another night. "Then you'll have to leave," Mrs. Duluth announced, loud enough for the breakfast guests to hear. "I don't keep rooms for those who can't pay. Please, if you could just give me time to find work. Every girl who comes through here has a sob story. You're no different." The proprietress turned her back, dismissing Clara entirely. Clara dragged her trunk back to the train depot, the morning already growing hot. The next eastbound train wouldn't arrive for 3 days. Even if it did, she had no money for a ticket. She sat on the platform bench, her trunk at her feet, and finally allowed herself to cry. The day passed in a haze of heat and humiliation. Townspeople walked by, some curious, others contemptuous. The ladies from the church auxiliary whispered behind their hands. Men made crude offers she refused with growing desperation. By evening, the station clerk took pity. "You can't stay here all night. Miss, it ain't safe." "Where else can I go?" Clara's voice was hoarse from thirst. She'd been too proud to beg for water. He shrugged helplessly. "Don't know, but you can't stay here." Clara gathered her strength and dragged her trunk to the edge of town, where the buildings gave way to desert. She found a cluster of cottonwoods near a dry creek bed and made a pitiful camp, using her trunk as a backrest. The temperature plummeted with the sun. She wrapped herself in every piece of clothing from her bag, but still shivered violently. That's when she saw him, a small figure emerging from the darkness, a boy, perhaps 8 or 9 years old, moving with the silent grace of a wild creature. His hair was black as midnight, his skin bronze even in the moonlight. Apache, she realized with a start. He approached slowly, like one might approach a wounded animal. His clothes were a mix of traditional hide and traded cloth. When he was close enough for her to see his eyes, dark, solemn, too old for his young face, he stopped. They regarded each other in silence. Clara was too exhausted and heartsick to feel afraid. What more could be taken from her? The boy stepped closer, close enough that she could see he was thin, underfed. He studied her with those ancient eyes, then slowly, deliberately, extended his small hand toward her. "Will you hold me until the night ends?" His English was carefully pronounced, as if he'd practiced the words. Clara stared at his outstretched hand, this strange child who'd materialized from the desert like a spirit. Perhaps she was dreaming. Perhaps the cold had finally driven her mad. But his hand remained steady, waiting, and something in his eyes, a loneliness that matched her own, made her reach out. He settled beside her with a soft sigh, his body providing surprising warmth despite his small size. They huddled together against her trunk, two abandoned souls beneath the vast Arizona stars. "Hey, what in the hell?" Rough voices shattered the quiet. 3 men stumbled from the direction of town, whiskey fumes preceding them. Clara recognized Jake from the depot. Well, look what we found. The high and mighty lady, snuggling with a savage brat." Clara pulled the boy closer, feeling him tense like a spring. "Leave us alone. Hear that, boys? She's telling us what to do." Jake swayed closer. "You wouldn't give an honest white man the time of day, but you'll cuddle up to an Apache? What kind of woman does that make you? The kind who prefers any company to yours." The words escaped before Clara could stop them. Jake's face darkened. He reached for her, but the boy suddenly erupted from her arms, placing himself between them with a fierce cry. Jake laughed and backhanded the child, sending him sprawling. "No!" Clara scrambled toward the boy, but Jake caught her arm. "Maybe we should teach you proper behavior." A shadow fell across them. Jake's words died as a massive figure stepped into the moonlight. The man stood well over 6 feet, his broad shoulders blocking the stars. Long black hair framed a face carved from stone. He wore traditional Apache dress, and his eyes promised death. Jake released Clara's arm, his hand moving to his gun, but the Apache moved faster than thought, disarming him with a motion so fluid it seemed like magic. The gun went spinning into the darkness. Jesus Christ, One of Jake's companions whispered, "Let's get out of here." They didn't need further encouragement. The three men fled back toward town, Jake clutching his wrist where the Apache had grabbed him. The warrior watched them go, then turned to the boy. His hands moved in rapid signs, Apache sign language. Clara realized. The boy responded, gesturing toward Clara. The man's dark eyes assessed her, not with the crude interest she'd grown accustomed to, but with something deeper, more complex. He moved toward the boy, lifting him effortlessly into his arms. The child wrapped his arms around the man's neck, clearly safe, clearly loved. They turned to leave, but the boy struggled, reaching back toward Clara. He said something in Apache, his voice pleading. The man stopped, looked back at Clara once more, then disappeared into the desert night as silently as he'd come. Clara sat alone in the darkness, shaking now from more than cold. The night stretched endlessly before her, and she wondered if morning would find her frozen beside this dry creek, another casualty of broken promises and foolish dreams. But she remembered the warmth of that small hand in hers, the fierce way the boy had tried to protect her despite his size, and the man, terrifying and gentle in the same moment, handling the child with such care. As she huddled against her trunk, Clara thought perhaps she wasn't the only soul abandoned in this harsh land. Perhaps survival meant finding others equally lost, equally rejected by the world that called itself civilized. The stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the desert, a coyote howled, lonely and defiant, claiming its place in the darkness. Dawn came slowly to the desert, painting the mountains crimson before touching the valley floor. Clara woke stiff and disoriented, her dress damp with dew. Every muscle ached from her night against the trunk. She sat up, squinting in the early light, and saw them, small footprints in the dust, leading away from her makeshift camp. The boy had been real. The giant Apache warrior had been real. The memory gave her an odd comfort as she considered her options. She couldn't return to town without money or prospects. She couldn't stay here without water or shelter. But those footprints led somewhere, and somewhere was better than nowhere. Clara stood on unsteady legs, brushing dust from her skirts. Her trunk was too heavy to carry far, so she removed what she could fit in her carpet bag: a change of clothes, her mother's Bible, a small sewing kit, and the last hard biscuit from her journey. The rest she covered with branches, hoping to return if fortune changed. The tracks were easy to follow in the soft earth. They led along the dry creek bed, then up a gradual slope dotted with mesquite and prickly pear. The morning sun climbed higher, and Clara soon regretted her heavy dress. Sweat trickled down her spine as she paused to rest against a boulder. That's when she saw it, a thin stream of smoke rising from beyond the next ridge. Her heart quickened. She climbed carefully, her boots slipping on loose stones, until she crested the rise. Below, nestled in a natural bowl of red rocks, stood a modest dwelling, part traditional Apache wickiup, part adapted cabin. A small spring fed a pool of clear water. Garden plots showed signs of careful tending. And there, sitting cross-legged by a morning fire, was the boy from the night before. He looked up at her approach, his face breaking into an unexpected smile. He called out in Apache, and the warrior emerged from the dwelling. In daylight, he was even more imposing, tall and powerfully built, with scars marking his arms and chest. But his eyes, when they found hers, held no threat. Instead, she saw surprise, perhaps even curiosity. The boy ran to her, taking her hand and tugging her toward their camp. He chattered in a mix of Apache and broken English, pointing at various things: the fire, the garden, a string of fish drying in the sun. "Hungry?" the boy asked, the word carefully pronounced. Clara nodded, suddenly aware of the hollow ache in her stomach. The boy led her to a flat stone near the fire, gesturing for her to sit. The warrior watched silently as the child brought her a wooden bowl filled with some kind of stew. Rabbit, she thought, with wild onions and herbs she didn't recognize. It was the best meal she'd eaten in weeks. "Thank you," she said to the boy, then looked up at the warrior. "Thank you." The man inclined his head slightly but said nothing. The boy pointed to himself. I am... He paused, struggling with something, then said a word in Apache that sounded like Ayana. Seeing her confusion, he tried again. In white words, Swift Fox. But you call me. He thought hard. You call me Jesse. Jesse. Clara smiled at the adaptation. I'm Clara. Jesse repeated her name several times, getting the pronunciation right. Then he pointed to the warrior. He is another Apache name. Complex and musical? Jesse frowned, translating. Stonewolf, but he made a gesture indicating silence. No white words, not since... The boy's face darkened, and he didn't finish. Instead, he showed Clara around their small compound with infectious enthusiasm. Here was where they dried meat. There, the warrior, Stonewolf, had built a clever system to channel spring water. This plant was good for cuts. That one made tea for stomach pain. Stonewolf shadowed them, never speaking, but Clara felt his presence constantly. When Jesse showed her a particularly steep path, Stonewolf's hand appeared at her elbow, steadying her. When the sun grew too hot, he gestured to a shaded overhang where she could rest. As the day wore on, Clara found herself studying him when she thought he wasn't looking. Despite his intimidating size, his movements held a careful grace. The way he handled tools, tended the fire, checked Jesse's small injuries from play, all spoke of gentle competence. But something haunted his eyes, a pain that ran bone deep. Evening approached, and Clara knew she should leave. But to go where? Jesse seemed to sense her thoughts. He tugged at her sleeve, eyes pleading. Stay, he asked. You stay. Clara looked at Stonewolf, trying to read his impassive face. He met her gaze for a long moment, then gave an almost imperceptible nod. Jesse whooped with joy, dancing around the fire. That night, they made her a bed of soft hides in a sheltered alcove. Clara lay wakefully, listening to the unfamiliar sounds of the desert, owl calls, rustling creatures, the distant yip of coyotes. Through the dwelling's opening, she could see Stonewolf sitting by the dying fire, keeping watch, protecting them. The sight made her feel safer than she'd felt in months. Days passed in a blur of adaptation. Clara learned to haul water from the spring, to identify edible plants, to build a proper fire. Her soft hands blistered, then calloused, her fair skin burned, then browned. Jesse was a patient teacher, delighting in her progress. Stonewolf remained silent but watchful, occasionally demonstrating a better technique with quiet efficiency. On her 5th day, Clara decided to venture back for her trunk. Jesse insisted on accompanying her, and Stonewolf followed at a distance. But when they reached the cottonwoods, the trunk was gone, stolen or destroyed, along with everything she'd left behind. Clara stared at the empty space, tears threatening. Her mother's china teacups, her few books, the quilt her grandmother had made, all gone. Jesse's small hand slipped into hers. Is okay, he said solemnly. We are, how you say, family now? The word broke something open inside her. She knelt and pulled Jesse into a fierce hug, weeping into his thin shoulder. When she finally looked up, Stonewolf stood nearby, her carpetbag in his hand. He'd carried it all the way without her noticing. His eyes held understanding. He too knew what it meant to lose everything. They returned to camp in contemplative silence. That evening, Stonewolf disappeared into the dwelling and emerged with something wrapped in deer hide. He placed it before Clara with unusual ceremony. Inside lay a dress, simple but beautifully made from soft buckskin, decorated with modest beadwork. Jesse bounced excitedly. Was his sister's, she... The boy's face fell. She gone now, like my mother, like father. Clara touched the dress reverently, understanding the magnitude of the gift. She looked up at Stonewolf, seeing past his stoic facade to the grief beneath. Thank you, she whispered. I'll honor it. Something shifted in his expression, a flicker of warmth quickly hidden. He nodded and turned away, but not before she caught what might have been the ghost of a smile. Life fell into a rhythm. Clara learned to cook Apache foods, to recognize the signs of coming weather, to move quietly through the brush. Jesse taught her words in Apache, laughing at her pronunciation but never mocking. Stonewolf began leaving small things for her: a sharper knife, a water gourd decorated with geometric patterns, a pair of moccasins that fit perfectly. But their peace was fragile. Twice, Clara saw riders in the distance, and each time Stonewolf hurried them into hiding. His tension was palpable until the strangers passed. She understood without being told. A white woman living with Apaches would bring trouble for them all. One evening, as Clara helped Jesse practice his letters in the dirt, she discovered he was hungry to learn. The boy grew serious. "Clara," he said carefully, "town people. They say bad things about you with us." Clara's hands stilled. She'd tried not to think about it, but she knew. The names they'd call her, the assumptions they'd make, her reputation, whatever remained of it, was surely destroyed. "Let them talk," she said finally. "Their words can't hurt us here." Jesse smiled, but it didn't quite reach his eyes. "My mother said that too, before soldiers came." That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She wandered to the spring, finding Stonewolf there, staring at the star-reflected water. For once, she didn't retreat. Instead, she sat beside him on the flat rock, leaving careful space between them. "Jesse told me about his parents," she said softly. "I'm sorry." Stonewolf's jaw tightened. His hands, she noticed, clenched and unclenched in his lap. "You don't have to speak," Clara continued. I know words can fail us. When my father died, I didn't speak for 3 months. My mother thought I'd been struck dumb, but sometimes silence is the only honest response to loss." He turned to look at her then, truly look at her. In the moonlight, she could see the question in his eyes. How did someone like her understand? "My mother died when I was 17, Clara found herself explaining. "Consumption. My father had passed 2 years before. A farming accident. I had no brothers, no sisters. The farm went to creditors. I worked in a boarding house kitchen, saving every penny, until I saw Mr. Morrison's advertisement. A prosperous rancher seeking a capable wife. A new life in the territories. I was so desperate to belong somewhere again that I believed every word." She laughed bitterly. "And now here I am, farther from home than ever, with nothing to my name but the kindness of—" She stopped, unsure how to finish. Of strangers? They weren't strangers anymore. Of Apaches. That felt wrong too, reducing them to their race. Stonewolf's hand moved slightly on the rock between them, not quite reaching for hers, but acknowledging her words. They sat in companionable silence until the night grew cold, then returned to camp together. The next morning brought trouble. Clara was grinding corn when Jesse came running, eyes wide with fear. "Riders!" he gasped. "5, with guns!" Stonewolf moved swiftly, pushing Clara into the dwelling and gesturing for her to stay hidden, through a gap in the walls. She watched him face the approaching men, cowboys by their look, hard-faced and armed. Well, the lead rider drawled. "The murdering savage himself. Thought you disappeared for good. Boy!" Stonewolf stood motionless, but Clara saw his hand inch toward the knife at his belt. "We're looking for a white woman," another rider said. "Crazy thing from back east. Disappeared from town about a week back. You seen her?" Stonewolf shook his head once. "Funny thing," the first rider continued. "Jake says he saw her out this way, keeping company with Apache trash. Says a big buck like you ran him off. That wouldn't be you, would it?" Jesse emerged from behind a rock. Moving to Stonewolf's side, the rider's eyes glinted dangerously. "Got yourself a pup, eh? Maybe we should take him back to town. Plenty of folks would pay good money for an Apache boy to train up proper." Stonewolf stepped forward, shielding Jesse. The tension crackled like lightning about to strike. Now. The lead rider raised a hand. "No need for unpleasantness. You just hand over the woman, and we'll be on our way. She's got a husband looking for her. You understand, legal-like." Clara's blood ran cold. A husband? But she'd never married. Understanding struck like a blow. Someone claiming to be Samuel Morrison. Someone who could legally claim her as property. Her hands shook as she gripped the wall. Stonewolf signed something rapidly to Jesse. The boy's face went pale, but he nodded and began backing toward the dwelling. "He's sending the boy for her," one rider guessed. "Good. Make this easy, and maybe we won't burn you out." But Jesse didn't fetch Clara. Instead, he darted past her to the back of the dwelling, returning with Stonewolf's rifle. The click of him cocking it rang across the clearing. "Well, hell!" the lead rider spat. "You want to do this hard?" The shot came from behind them. Another group of riders appeared, 3 more men, all armed. Clara recognized Jake among them, his arm still bandaged from his encounter with Stonewolf. "Thought you might need help. Tom," Jake called to the first group. "That buck's trickier than he looks." 8 against 2, one of them a child. Clara couldn't let this happen. Before she could think, she stepped from the dwelling. "I'm here," she called out. "There's no need for violence." The men turned, grins spreading across their faces. Clara held her head high, though fear coursed through her veins. "Well, there she is." Tom said, "Come on down, lady. Your husband's waiting." "I have no husband," Clara stated firmly. "I was deceived. Whoever claims me is a liar." "That ain't for us to decide," Jake interjected. "Law says you belong to him that paid your way out here. You took his money. You owe him service. I'll repay every cent." "With what?" Tom laughed. "Look at you, dressed like a squaw. Living in dirt with savages. You got nothing to repay with except what he already bought." Clara felt Stonewolf move closer to her, radiating protective fury. Jesse still held the rifle, though it trembled in his small hands. "Please," she tried again. "I'll come willingly if you leave them alone." "Can't do that," Jake said, enjoying himself. Boy pointed a gun at lawful citizens. That's a hanging offense, even for an Apache brat. "He's a child." "Nits make lice," another rider said casually, and Clara's stomach turned at the casual cruelty. Stonewolf made a sound, the first she'd heard from him. Low, threatening, like distant thunder. His hand found her arm, gently pushing her behind him. The message was clear. He would die before letting them take her or Jesse. The standoff stretched taut, 8 guns against 1 rifle and a knife. Clara closed her eyes, praying to a god who'd seemed absent for so long. "What in blazes is going on here?" A new voice broke the tension. An older man rode into view, wearing a sheriff's badge. Behind him rode 2 deputies and, surprisingly, Mrs. Duluth from the hotel. "Sheriff Garrett," Tom said smoothly, "just retrieving stolen property." "Don't look like property to me." The sheriff replied, "Looks like you're threatening folks on their own land." "Apache don't own land." Jake protested. "This here's the old Riverside claim," Sheriff Garrett said mildly. "Abandoned in 81. Anyone can stake it who works it, and seems to me it's being worked." He looked at Clara. "Ma'am, you being held against your will?" Clara's voice rang clear. "No, sir, I'm here by choice." "She's addled," Tom argued. "No decent woman would—" "What I would or wouldn't do is my business," Clara interrupted. "I'm not married. I owe no man service, and I choose to stay where I'm treated with kindness." "Mrs." Duluth spoke up unexpectedly. "Girl came to my hotel with nothing, no ring, no marriage papers. If some man's claiming her, let him come forward proper-like, not send thugs to drag her off." Sheriff Garrett nodded slowly. "Seems reasonable. You boys best move along. Any man has a legal claim can present it to the court." The riders grumbled, but faced with actual law, they had no choice. As they turned to leave, Jake called out, "This ain't over, squaw man. We'll be back." Stonewolf remained still as granite until the last rider disappeared over the ridge. Only then did his shoulders drop, and Clara saw his hands shaking slightly. Jesse dropped the rifle and ran to him, burrowing against his side. Sheriff Garrett dismounted, approaching slowly. "Dan Rivers," he said to Stonewolf. That's your Christian name, isn't it? I remember you from before everything went bad. Stonewolf, Dan, nodded once. Thought you'd gone to the reservation. Dan shook his head, his arm tightening around Jesse. Well, you've got right to be here as any man, papers or no papers. But you know they'll make trouble. The sheriff looked at Clara. Ma'am, you sure about this? It's a hard life you're choosing. Clara looked at Jesse's frightened face, at Dan's protective stance. She thought of cold nights warmed by their presence, of learning to laugh again at Jesse's antics, of the quiet strength Dan offered without words. I've tried the easy life, Sheriff. It brought me nothing but lies. I'll take hard truth over false comfort. The sheriff sighed. Your choice. But if someone does come claiming legal marriage, I'll have to investigate. After they left, Clara sank onto a stone. Trembling, Jesse crawled into her lap like a much younger child, and she held him tight. Dan stood guard a while longer before finally joining them, sitting close enough that his warmth reached her. They'll come back, Clara said quietly. Dan nodded. Jesse looked up at her, eyes bright with unshed tears. You stay? The boy whispered. Even with trouble? Clara kissed his forehead. Where else would I go? This is home now. Dan's hand covered hers where it rested on Jesse's shoulder, the first time he'd deliberately touched her. His palm was calloused, but gentle, and in that simple contact, Clara felt a promise. Whatever came, they would face it together. As night fell, she helped prepare their simple meal, wearing the buckskin dress that had belonged to Dan's sister. The transformation felt complete. Clara Whitmore, the desperate Eastern bride, was gone. In her place stood someone stronger, someone who'd chosen her own path despite the cost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges. The men would return, perhaps with papers, perhaps with violence. But tonight, she sat by the fire with her strange new family, teaching Jesse to write his name while Dan carved something from soft wood, a toy horse. She realized, for the boy, the desert sang its night song around them, and Clara found herself humming along, an old hymn her mother used to sing, now given new meaning in this place of exile and unexpected grace. When Jesse yawned, Dan carried him to bed. Clara banked the fire and tidied their few possessions, domestic tasks that felt like declarations of permanence. She was still working when Dan returned, standing uncertainly at the edge of firelight. Thank you, Clara said, for being willing to fight for us. He moved closer, his dark eyes holding hers, slowly, carefully. He reached up and touched her face, just a brush of fingers against her cheek, but it made her breath catch. Then he pointed to himself, to her, to the dwelling where Jesse slept. Family, the gesture said. We are family. Yes, Clara whispered. Family? He smiled then, the first true smile she'd seen from him. It transformed his face, revealing the man beneath the warrior's mask. Then he took up his rifle and walked to his usual guard post, keeping watch through the night. Clara returned to her bed of hides, no longer a guest but a member of this small, fierce clan. Whatever tomorrow brought, she would meet it as she'd learned to meet everything in this hard land, with courage, with grace, and with the unshakable knowledge that she was no longer alone. The stars wheeled overhead, and somewhere in the darkness, a night bird called, not mournful now, but welcoming, as if the desert itself had finally accepted her as its own. The days that followed brought a strange peace. Clara threw herself into learning the rhythms of desert life with determination that surprised even herself. Each morning, she woke before dawn to help Dan check his snare lines, moving through the brush with growing stealth. Her feet, once tender in city boots, now found their way surely across rough ground in the moccasins he'd made her. Like this, Jesse demonstrated, showing her how to reset a snare without leaving human scent. Rabbits are smart. They smell you, they go other way. Clara mimicked his movements, earning an approving nod. The boy had become her constant shadow, chattering in his mix of English and Apache as they worked. Through him, she learned not just survival skills, but glimpses of the life they'd lived before soldiers came, before the wars, before silence stole Dan's voice. My mother. She made best pine nut cakes. Jessie told her one afternoon as they gathered the precious nuts. She sing while cooking. Dan's sister, too. They sing together, like birds. What happened to them? Clara asked gently, though she suspected she knew. Jessie's young face hardened. Soldiers came at dawn, said we must go to reservation. My father said we live here always. This is our place. He stopped, struggling. Dan tried to stop them. They hurt his throat. After that, no words come. Clara's heart clenched. She looked across the camp to where Dan was repairing the water channel. His strong hands patient with the work. No wonder he didn't speak, couldn't speak. The trauma had stolen more than just his family. That evening, as she prepared their meal, venison stew with wild onions and the last of their corn, she found herself humming. It was an old lullaby her mother used to sing. Jessie perked up immediately. You sing like them, he said wonderingly. Like the women before. Dan looked up from sharpening his knife, something unreadable in his expression. Clara felt self-conscious but continued humming as she worked. When Jessie asked her to sing the words, she obliged, her voice soft in the twilight. In the quiet of the evening, when the stars begin to shine, guardian angels hover near this little heart of mine. Jessie listened raptly, and even Dan set aside his work, drawn by the gentle melody. When she finished, Jessie clapped. More! Sing more! So began a new ritual. Each evening, Clara would sing lullabies, hymns, folk songs remembered from childhood. Jessie would curl against her side, fighting sleep to hear just one more. And Dan would sit close by, his presence solid and comforting, occasionally carving small figures from wood as he listened. The desert was teaching her its secrets. She learned to find water by watching where the bees flew at sunset. Dan showed her which cacti held moisture, how to harvest them without injury. She discovered she had steady hands for fletching arrows, binding the hawk feathers just so under Dan's patient guidance. You good student, Jessie announced proudly one day as Clara successfully brought down a quail with her practice bow. Better than white women in town. They just sit and fan faces. I used to be one of them, Clara admitted. Worried about proper gloves and clean hems. Not now, Jessie said with certainty. Now you are the people, like us. Clara glanced at Dan, wondering if he agreed with the boy's assessment. He met her eyes and nodded slowly, a gesture that warmed her more than the desert sun. But their peaceful days were numbered. It started with small signs, fresh horse tracks near the spring, cigarette butts on the trail to town. Someone was watching them. Dan grew increasingly vigilant, often disappearing for hours to scout the surrounding area. He began teaching Clara and Jessie hand signals, creating escape plans they practiced until even Jessie could move silently through agreed-upon routes. The cut on Clara's hand came from her own clumsiness, catching her palm on a broken basket while reaching for herbs. It wasn't deep, but it bled freely. Before she could tend it herself, Dan was there, taking her hand with surprising gentleness. He led her to the stone by the spring, producing a small parfleche bag from his belt. Inside were various dried plants and powders. He selected one, yarrow, she thought, and made a paste with spring water. His touch as he cleaned the wound was infinitely careful, his face intent on the task. Clara found herself studying him, the way his hair fell forward, the small scar bisecting his left eyebrow, the concentration that drew his brows together. When he began wrapping her hand with a strip of clean cloth, she felt his fingers tremble slightly. Dan, she said softly. He looked up, and their faces were suddenly very close. Clara could see flecks of gold in his dark eyes, could feel the warmth of his breath. Time seemed to stretch like honey in the sun. His hand still cradled hers, the bandage half finished. She didn't know who moved first. Perhaps they both did, but suddenly his free hand was cupping her cheek, thumb brushing across her cheekbone with impossible tenderness. Clara's eyes fluttered closed as he leaned closer. Clara! Dan! Look what I found! They sprang apart as Jessie came running, proudly displaying a hawk feather. If the boy noticed their flushed faces or the charged air between them, he gave no sign. After that, awareness hummed between them like a taut bowstring. Clara would catch Dan watching her as she worked, his gaze holding something new, not just protectiveness now, but longing. When their hands accidentally touched passing food or tools, both would freeze for a heartbeat before continuing. She found herself watching him too, the play of muscles as he drew his bow, the rare half-smile when Jesse made him laugh, the way firelight turned his bronze skin to copper. At night, she lay wakeful on her bed of hides, acutely aware of his presence just beyond the dwelling's wall where he kept watch. The attack on her reputation came before the physical one. Jesse returned from a water run with tears streaming down his face and cruel words ringing in his ears. Some cowboys had caught him alone, filling his head with poison about Clara. They said terrible things. Jesse sobbed against Clara's shoulder. About you and Dan. Said you were... Shh, Clara soothed, though rage boiled in her chest. Words can't change what's true. We know who we are. Dan's face was thunderous as he signed rapid questions to Jesse. The boy's answers made his expression darken further. That night, he doubled his patrols, and Clara noticed he'd moved their weapon cache closer to the dwelling. The full assault came 3 days later. Clara was alone at the spring. Dan had taken Jesse hunting, teaching him to track deer. She heard the horses before she saw them, but by then it was too late to run. 5 men surrounded the spring. Not the cowboys from before. These were harder men, wearing dusters despite the heat, hired guns. Mrs. Morrison, the leader said politely, tipping his hat. Your husband sent us to bring you home. I have no husband, Clara stated, proud that her voice didn't shake. Legal documents say otherwise. He produced a folded paper, marriage by proxy, all nice and legal. You accepted his money. That sealed the contract. Clara's mind raced. Marriage by proxy was sometimes recognized in the territories. She knew, if someone had forged documents, I never consented to any marriage. Don't matter much now, does it? The man's politeness never wavered, which made it more chilling. You come quiet-like, or we take you loud. Your choice. Clara gripped the water gourd tighter. And if I refuse? Well now, that'd be unfortunate. See, we also got papers declaring your Apache friends hostile Indians, unlawfully off the reservation. Be a shame if something happened while we were trying to arrest them legal-like. The threat was clear. Come, or Dan and Jesse would pay the price. If I come, Clara said slowly. You leave them alone? That's the deal. She closed her eyes, seeing Dan's rare smile, feeling Jesse's small hand in hers. They'd given her everything. Home, purpose, family. The least she could do was protect them. Let me gather my things. No need. Mr. Morrison's providing everything new. Says he don't want nothing that's touched Apache hide. They barely let her leave a sign, just a broken arrow pointing toward town, hoping Dan would understand she hadn't left by choice. As they rode away, Clara looked back once at the peaceful camp that had become her world. The lullaby she'd sung last night echoed mockingly in her mind. The ride to Mercy's Bend passed in grim silence. Clara memorized the route, already planning escape. They deposited her at the Imperial Hotel, where Mrs. Duluth waited with a mixture of pity and disapproval. Got your room ready, the proprietress said. Mr. Morrison paid in advance. He'll be along shortly to make your acquaintance proper. The room was a prison, windows nailed shut, door locking from outside. A white wedding dress lay across the bed like a shroud. Clara paced the small space, her body remembering freedom, craving the desert's vast embrace. When the door finally opened, she expected some brute. Instead, a well-dressed man of middle years entered, carrying himself with the oily confidence of a successful merchant. My dear Clara, he said warmly, at last we meet. I'm Samuel Morrison, though I suppose you've guessed that was a fabrication. Name's actually Josiah Pritchard. No matter. What counts is we're together now. We are not together, Clara said coldly. This is kidnapping. Nonsense. Legal marriage. Legal retrieval of wayward property. His eyes traveled over her, and Clara's skin crawled. Though I must say, living with savages has given you a certain wild quality. We'll have to train that out of you. He approached, and Clara smelled pomade and stale whiskey. Now, about your wifely duties. The whiskey bottle was in her hand before conscious thought. It connected with his skull with a satisfying crack. Pritchard dropped like a stone, blood seeping into the expensive carpet. Clara didn't check if he lived. She stripped off the buckskin dress, her dress, Dan's gift, and put it on under a stolen cloak. The window might be nailed, but the boards were old. 3 kicks loosened them enough to squeeze through. She dropped into the alley as shouts erupted from the hotel, running through darkened streets. Clara felt more animal than woman, her body remembering Jesse's lessons about moving unseen. The storm building on the horizon helped, wind masking sound and dust obscuring sight. By the time she reached the outskirts, rain was falling in sheets. Clara stumbled through the deluge, following instinct more than landmarks. Lightning illuminated the landscape in stark flashes. There, the twisted mesquite marking the halfway point. There, the red rocks rising like sentinels. When Dan's silhouette appeared through the rain, Clara nearly sobbed with relief. He caught her as she stumbled, his arms fierce around her. For a moment they simply held each other, rain streaming over them like a benediction. Then he was lifting her, carrying her to shelter, not the camp. She realized, but a hidden cave higher in the rocks. Jesse waited inside with their essential supplies. They'd been preparing to come for her. How did you? Clara began. Dan touched the broken arrow at his belt, and she understood. He'd found her sign, read her message. Of course he had. Jesse threw himself at her, trembling. Thought you left us, he whispered. Thought you chose them. Never, Clara said fiercely. You're my family, both of you. She told them about Pritchard, the fake marriage, her escape. Dan's expression grew murderous when she described the man's intentions. His hands, checking her for injury, shook with suppressed rage. He's either dead or wishing he was. Clara finished. Either way, they'll come hunting. Dan nodded grimly. He'd already packed what they needed: weapons, food, water, the few precious belongings that mattered. They would go deeper into the mountains, to places even the Apache scouts would struggle to find. As they prepared to leave with first light, Clara caught Dan's arm. I'm sorry, I brought this trouble to you. He shook his head emphatically, then did something unexpected. Slowly, struggling with the effort, he forced out a single word, the first she'd heard from him. Stay. It came out rough, damaged, barely recognizable, but it was there, his voice, broken but undefeated, asking her to remain. Always, Clara promised, tears mixing with rain on her cheeks. Always. They left the cave at dawn, 3 shadows melting into the mountain's embrace. Behind them, Mercy's Bend would rage and search, but the desert kept its own counsel. And somewhere in the vast silence, a new family moved like ghosts through ancient paths, bound by choice rather than blood, by love rather than law. Jesse rode on Dan's shoulders, playing lookout. Clara walked beside them, her hand occasionally brushing Dan's, each touch a promise. They were outlaws now, all of them, but they were free, and they were together. And in this hard land, that was everything. The storm had washed away their tracks. The desert had reclaimed their camp. And Clara Whitmore, mail-order bride, proper Eastern lady, had ceased to exist. In her place walked something fiercer and truer, a woman who'd chosen her own path and would defend it with her life. As the sun climbed higher, painting the mountains gold and crimson, Clara began to sing, not a lullaby this time, but an old ballad about wanderers and freedom. Jesse's young voice joined hers, and even Dan hummed along in his broken way. The desert listened and approved, welcoming its newest children home. The desert transformed Clara like fire tempers steel. 6 weeks into their mountain refuge, her hands could gut a rabbit swift as any Apache woman. Her eyes could spot game trails invisible to her former self. The woman who'd stepped off that train in October seemed like a half-remembered dream. Their new camp nestled high in a box canyon, accessible only through a narrow defile that Dan could defend single-handed. A hidden spring fed a small pool, and ancient cliff dwellings provided shelter improved by their own additions. Here, they carved out a life beyond the reach of Mercedes-Benz justice. Jesse thrived in their exile. His nightmares came less frequently, and his laughter echoed off canyon walls as he played with the toy horses Dan carved. The boy shadowed Clara constantly, absorbing her lessons as eagerly as she absorbed his. "You must learn the plants," Jesse instructed seriously one morning, leading her along the canyon floor. "This one," he pointed to a scraggly bush, "makes good tea for belly pain. But this one," indicating its nearly identical neighbor, "makes you sleep forever." Clara memorized each distinction carefully. In this land, knowledge meant survival. Dan watched their lessons with approval, occasionally adding his own wordless demonstrations. His single-spoken word, "stay," remained precious and unrepeated. But his communication had grown rich in other ways. A glance could convey volumes. A gesture could speak poetry. She found herself studying him during quiet moments, the way he fletched arrows with mechanical precision while his mind clearly wandered, how his face softened when Jesse laughed, the careful distance he maintained from her even in their small shared spaces. That distance had become a living thing between them, charged with unspoken possibility. The day everything changed started like any other. Jesse had convinced Clara to let him check snares alone. "I'm not a baby," he'd protested with 9-year-old dignity. Dan was hunting higher in the mountains. Clara worked at stretching a rabbit hide, humming as she scraped. She didn't hear Jesse return. Only his strangled gasp made her look up. The boy stood frozen at the canyon entrance, eyes wide with terror. Blood ran from a gash on his forehead. "Jesse!" Clara dropped everything, rushing to him. "What happened?" "Men," he whispered. "Many men. They found our old camp. They're tracking—" He swayed, and she caught him. "How far?" Maybe half day. I ran fast, took creek paths to hide trail, but determined trackers would eventually find their way." Clara's mind raced as she cleaned Jesse's wound. A branch had caught him as he fled through thick brush. They needed Dan, needed to prepare defenses or flee deeper into the mountains. "Can you climb to the lookout?" she asked Jesse. He nodded, though pain clouded his eyes. "I can do it." "Good. Take the signal mirror. Flash it toward Eagle Peak. 3 long, 3 short, 3 long. Dan will see." As Jesse climbed, Clara worked with desperate efficiency. She packed their essential belongings: ammunition, dried meat, water gourds, the small bag of herbs that served as their medicine. Dan's sister's dress went in first, wrapped carefully. Jesse's toy horses, the knife Dan had made for her, its handle worn smooth by her palm. But even as she packed for flight, anger built in her chest. They'd done nothing but try to live free. Why should they run forever? Dan arrived as the sun reached its zenith, reading the situation in a glance: Jesse's wounds, Clara's preparations, the defensive set of her shoulders. All told the story. He signed rapidly. "How many? How far?" "Jesse saw maybe 8 men, half a day behind, but they found our old camp." Dan's face went grim. 8 men meant serious pursuit, not casual harassment. Someone, Pritchard if he lived, his associates if not, had hired professional trackers. He made a decision, signing instructions too quick for Clara to follow completely. Jesse, despite his injury, translated. "He says you take horses. Go to Hidden Spring. Wait 3 days. If we don't come—" "No." Clara's voice cut like flint. "We stay together or not at all." Dan's expression darkened. He gestured sharply. This was not time for sentiment, but Clara had learned stubbornness in these mountains. "You think I'd abandon you? After everything?" She stepped closer, close enough to see the war in his eyes between protection and desire. "I'm not some fragile Eastern flower anymore. Dan, I'm what this life made me. What you helped make me." For a long moment they stared at each other. wills clashing. Then something in Dan's face shifted. Resignation, acceptance, perhaps even pride. He nodded once, sharply, and began planning their defense. They worked through the afternoon, transforming their peaceful refuge into a fortress. The narrow canyon entrance became a killing field, rigged with deadfalls and hidden positions. Clara learned to load rifles with smooth efficiency while Jesse, despite his wound, prepared bundles of arrows. As shadows lengthened, Dan did something unexpected. He brought out a small pot of paint, red ochre mixed with bear fat, and began marking his face with careful strokes. War paint, Clara realized. Not worn for show, but for protection, for power. He offered the pot to her. After a moment's hesitation, Clara dipped her fingers, drawing lines across her cheeks as she'd seen him do. Jesse solemnly added his own marks. If they would fight as Apache. Night fell with no sign of pursuit. They ate cold food, unwilling to risk a fire. Jesse curled between them, exhausted by pain and fear. Clara found herself stroking the boy's hair, humming softly until his breathing deepened. "He's strong," she whispered to Dan. "Stronger than any child should need to be." Dan's hand covered hers where it rested on Jesse's shoulder. In the darkness, he shifted closer until she could feel his warmth along her side. The gesture broke through his careful distance, acknowledging what might come with dawn. Clara turned her hand palm up, interlacing their fingers. "Whatever happens tomorrow," he squeezed gently, understanding. Whatever happened, they'd face it as one. But morning brought unexpected visitors. Not the trackers, not yet, but two Apache warriors materializing from the rocks like spirits. Dan tensed, then relaxed with recognition. Rapid signs flew between them, too fast for Clara to follow. "Uncle," Jesse exclaimed, waking to see one of the warriors. Not actual uncle. Clara understood, but clan relationship. The warriors studied Clara with frank curiosity. A white woman wearing paint, holding a rifle with easy familiarity. Her place in their camp unquestioned. After long moments, one nodded approval. Through Jesse's translation and the warriors' limited English, the story emerged. They were scouts from a band hidden deeper in the mountains. They'd been watching the trackers, who were indeed coming but moving cautiously, aware they entered Apache territory. "We could go with them." Jesse translated Dan's signs hopefully. "Join the band. Be safe." But the warriors' expressions turned regretful. The band was moving south, fleeing army patrols. They couldn't take in strangers who would slow their escape, especially not a white woman who would draw additional pursuit. They offered what help they could. Information about the trackers' numbers and weapons. Suggestions for alternate escape routes. Then they melted away as suddenly as they'd come, leaving gifts of ammunition and pemmican. "We're alone again," Jesse said quietly. "No," Clara corrected. "We have each other." The trackers came with full daylight. 8 men, as Jesse had counted, spread in a semicircle around the canyon entrance. Professional manhunters, patient and methodical. "Clara Whitmore," the leader's voice echoed off stone. "Or should I say, Mrs. Pritchard. Your husband survived, though he'll carry scars. He's offering good money for your return. More if the savages are dead." Clara's response was a rifle shot that kicked dust at his feet. "There's my answer. Figured as much." The man sounded almost admiring. "All right, boys. We do this the hard way." The first assault came in a rush. 3 men charged, while others laid covering fire. Dan's rifle cracked steadily from his position. Dropping one attacker, Clara fired and reloaded with mechanical precision, proud when her shot sent another diving for cover. Jesse used his small bow from a protected spot, his arrows forcing men to keep their heads down. But 8 against 3 couldn't last. The trackers were too experienced, too well armed. They began working around the defenses, using every scrap of cover. That's when Clara smelled smoke. Her heart sank as she realized their strategy. Fire them out like rats. Already, brush at the canyon mouth crackled with flames fanned by desert wind. Dan appeared at her side, gesturing urgently. Time to fall back to their final position. the old cliff dwelling. Defensible, but ultimately a trap. They gathered Jesse and retreated, smoke thickening around them. The ancient rooms carved from living rock had sheltered people for centuries. Now they provided last refuge for 3 more souls. Dan had cached water here, enough for days. But what good was water against smoke and flame? "I'm scared," Jesse whispered, pressed against Clara's side. "So am I," she admitted. "But fear keeps us sharp." Dan crouched at the entrance, picking off any tracker who showed himself. But return fire chipped rock around him, and smoke rose inexorably. Clara tore strips from her petticoat, soaking them with precious water for breathing masks. Then, through smoke and gunfire, came something unexpected. Apache war cries from beyond the canyon. The 2 warriors had returned, and they hadn't come alone. A dozen fighters swept down on the trackers' exposed backs, swift and terrible as a desert storm. The manhunters, caught between fortress and fury, scattered. Those who ran toward the burning canyon mouth met Dan's rifle. Those who turned to fight the Apache found warriors who'd been fighting in these mountains for generations. In minutes, the siege became a rout. When the smoke cleared, 5 trackers lay dead. The others had fled, leaving horses and supplies in their haste. The Apache warriors stood victorious but wary, speaking rapidly with Dan in their own tongue. Through Jesse, Clara learned their decision. The warriors' band couldn't take them in, but this attack would bring army retaliation on all Apache in the region. The warriors would lead false trails north, drawing pursuit away. Dan's family and Clara's heart swelled at the word should flee south into Mexico, where Apache could still live free. "Will we see you again, Uncle?" Jesse asked the warrior he'd recognized. The man's weathered face softened. "Perhaps. The world is wide, but paths cross in strange ways." He looked at Clara, speaking slowly in English. "You fight like Apache woman, like—" He said a name in his language. Dan went very still. "Like my sister," Jesse translated unnecessarily. Clara had understood from Dan's reaction. "She was brave," the warrior continued. "You honor her spirit." Then they were gone, vanishing into the landscape as if they'd never been. Dan, Clara, and Jesse stood alone among the dead, smoke still rising from the canyon mouth. "We can't stay," Clara said quietly. Dan nodded. He looked at her, at Jesse, then south toward Mexico and uncertainty. His hands moved. "Together, together," Clara confirmed. "Always together." They spent the day preparing for a journey that might never end. The trackers' horses would carry them far. The supplies bought them time. But more than that, they had each other, a strange family forged in fire and loss, bound by choice and tested by blood, as they prepared to leave the mountains that had sheltered them. Dan did something that stopped Clara's heart. He took her face gently between his hands, looked into her eyes with fierce tenderness, and spoke, forcing out words through his damaged throat. "My heart, yours." 3 words, bought with obvious pain, worth more than all the poetry in the world. Clara pulled him down for a kiss that tasted of smoke and promise, while Jesse made exaggerated gagging sounds that broke the spell and made them laugh. They rode out at sunset, toward Mexico and freedom. Behind them, the mountains held their secrets. Ahead, the desert stretched endless and unforgiving. But Clara had learned the desert's lessons well. It took everything soft and unnecessary, burning it away until only the essential remained. What remained in her was love, for the silent man who'd given her shelter, for the boy who'd taught her strength, for this hard land that had remade her in its image. The stars emerged one by one, ancient witnesses to yet another flight across their domain. Clara began to sing, not a lullaby or hymn, but an Apache travel song Jesse had taught her. Her voice rose strong and clear in the cooling air, joined by Jesse's young tones and Dan's rough harmony. 3 voices in the darkness, heading toward tomorrow. Whatever waited in Mexico or beyond, they would meet it as they'd met everything else, together, unafraid, and free. The man who rode into their Mexican refuge wore expensive clothes poorly, like a costume that didn't quite fit. Clara recognized him immediately, despite never having seen him conscious. Josiah Pritchard, bearing scars from their last encounter. His left eye clouded white where the bottle had struck true. They'd been living peacefully in the small adobe 3 miles from the village of Santa Elena. 6 months of quiet days, Dan working horses for the local ranchers, Clara taking in sewing, Jesse attending the mission school where the padre didn't care if his students were Apache, Mexican, or anything else as long as they came to learn. But peace, Clara had learned, was always temporary for people like them. "Mrs. Pritchard," the man called from beyond their gate. 4 armed riders flanking him. "I've come a long way to retrieve my property." Dan emerged from the stable, rifle in hand. Jesse appeared at Clara's side, no longer the skinny child from the desert, but growing tall and lean, hand resting on the knife at his belt. "I'm no one's property," Clara replied steadily. "You're in Mexico now. Mr. Pritchard, your false papers have no power here." "Perhaps not." He touched his ruined eye. "But gold speaks every language. The rurales are already on their way. You can come quietly, or watch your savages hang for kidnapping a white woman." Clara felt Dan tense beside her, ready to fight, but she'd learned strategy in their months of flight. Violence here would bring the whole village down on them. These people had shown them kindness. She wouldn't repay it with bloodshed. "1 hour," she said. "Give me 1 hour to gather my things, and I'll come." Pritchard's good eye narrowed suspiciously. "No tricks. No tricks. You have my word." Dan's hand caught her arm, his dark eyes fierce with denial. Jesse made a wounded sound, but Clara had already seen their path. "Trust me," she whispered in Apache, one of many words Jesse had taught her. "Get the horses ready. Pack light." Understanding flashed across Dan's face. He signed rapidly to Jesse, who nodded and disappeared into the house. Dan held her gaze a moment longer, a lifetime of words in that look, then moved toward the stable with deliberate calm. Pritchard waited beyond the gate, satisfied with apparent victory. His men relaxed, lighting cigarettes, certain they'd won. They didn't notice the village children who'd been playing nearby scatter with unusual purpose. They didn't see the old woman hanging laundry suddenly hurry inside. They'd been in Mexico long enough to recognize the signs, but these men saw only what they expected, a beaten woman preparing to submit. Clara went inside, ostensibly to pack. In reality, she loaded Dan's revolvers, filled water gourds, grabbed the small bag of silver pesos they'd saved. Jesse had already bundled their few precious things. Dan's sister's dress, now worn soft with use, the wooden horses Dan carved, the Bible that had been Clara's mother's, its margins now filled with Apache words Jesse helped her write. Through the back window, she saw Dan leading 3 horses from the hidden corral, keeping the stable between him and Pritchard's view. Jesse slipped through shadows like the desert fox he was named for, carrying their supplies. 40 minutes. The church bell would ring soon for evening prayers. That would be their signal. Clara returned to the front door, carpetbag in hand, playing the defeated woman. "I need to say goodbye," she told Pritchard. "To the boy. You can understand that. 5 minutes," he granted magnanimously. "Then we leave." She found Jesse by the well, Dan standing guard nearby. To watching eyes, it would look like farewell. In reality, she was checking the loads in the rifle Jesse had hidden there that morning, always preparing for the worst. "When the bell rings," she murmured, "take the canyon road. I'll be right behind you." "Clara," Jesse's voice broke. He wasn't a child anymore, but sometimes the boy still showed through. "We stay together," she promised. "Always." The church bell tolled, calling the faithful to prayer. It also called the village to action. Clara had learned that Santa Elena protected its own, and 6 months of quiet living, of helping with harvests and sharing medicines, had made them part of the community. As the bell rang, things happened quickly. The old woman reappeared, throwing her wash water with suspicious accuracy into the face of Pritchard's nearest guard. Children materialized from nowhere, spooking the horses with firecrackers left from the last feast day. The padre himself emerged from the church, voice booming about sanctuary and sin, gathering a crowd that somehow blocked the street. In the chaos, Clara moved, not toward Pritchard but to the rifle at the well. Her shot took the hat off his head, sending him diving for cover. "That was for my eye," she called. "The next is for my life." Dan and Jessie were already mounted, leading her horse. Clara backed toward them, rifle steady, as the village created a magnificent distraction. Someone's chickens had mysteriously escaped. Adding to the confusion, a cart overturned, blocking pursuit. She leaped onto her horse as Dan spurred his forward, Jessie between them. They thundered through the narrow streets, villagers stepping aside with timing too perfect to be coincidence. Behind them, Pritchard's curses rose above the chaos, but his men were trapped in a maze of helpful obstacles. They rode hard into the gathering darkness, taking paths Dan had scouted months ago for just such need. The canyon road twisted through rough country, treacherous for strangers but familiar to them now. Miles from the village, they finally stopped to breathe the horses. Jessie was crying silently, the way he'd learned to cry, without sound that might give them away. Clara pulled him close. "I'm sorry," the boy whispered. "I thought we were safe. I made friends. I went to school. I pretended we were normal." "Oh, my brave boy." Clara held him tighter. "We are normal. It's the world that's twisted, not us." Dan dismounted, checking their back trail with practiced eyes. Satisfied they weren't immediately pursued, he came to Jessie's other side. Together, they held the boy between them, a circle of protection against a world that wouldn't let them be. When Jessie's tears were spent, they rode on more slowly, needing to spare the horses. The night was clear, stars bright enough to navigate by. They avoided the main roads, keeping to deer paths and dry washes. "Where now?" Jessie asked eventually. It was the eternal question. Where could an Apache man, a white woman, and a half-grown boy find peace? They'd tried the mountains, tried Mexico. Every place eventually forced them to run. Dan pointed west, toward the coast. Ships, his gesture suggested. Perhaps across the ocean lay a place where their strange family wouldn't draw violence. Or deeper into Mexico. Clara suggested, "The southern jungles, places where no one asks questions." They debated quietly as they rode, but Clara knew the truth. It didn't matter where they went. Pritchard had proven he'd follow her to hell itself. His pride, scarred like his face, wouldn't let him abandon the hunt, and there would always be men like him. Seeing her choice to love freely as a personal insult, they made cold camp near dawn, exhausted horses and humans needing rest. Dan took first watch while Clara and Jessie curled together under shared blankets. But sleep wouldn't come. Her mind raced with plans and fears. "You should have gone," Jessie whispered. "With him, we would have found you again." "Would you have?" Clara asked gently. "How many times can a family be torn apart before it stops being a family?" Jessie was quiet so long she thought he'd fallen asleep. "Then, my first family died, but you and Dan, you chose me, chose us. That's stronger, isn't it? Choice." "Yes," Clara said firmly. "Choice is everything." Dan woke them as the sun peaked. His face was grim, dust on the horizon. Riders coming fast. They saddled quickly, but tired horses couldn't outrun fresh ones forever. The chase lasted through the morning, their lead shrinking steadily. By noon, gunshots echoed across the desert. Not aimed shots yet, warnings, trying to spook them into stopping. But soon enough, those bullets would find marks. Dan led them into a maze of arroyos, buying time, but not escape. The horses were stumbling, foam-flecked, nearly done. When they emerged onto a flat plain with nowhere to hide, Clara knew they'd run as far as they could. "Stop," she called. "We make our stand here." They dismounted, using the exhausted horses as cover, 3 rifles against however many Pritchard had gathered. Not good odds, but better than being run to death. The riders appeared, 8 men including Pritchard. They spread in a half circle, taking their time now, savoring victory. "Surrender the woman," Pritchard called. "The savages can go free." Dan's response was a shot that sent Pritchard's hat flying again. The man really should learn to duck faster, Clara thought with wild humor. The firefight was brief and vicious. Clara had become a good shot in their months of running, and Jesse's young eyes were sharp. They held the riders at bay, but ammunition wouldn't last forever. Then, impossibly, salvation came from an unexpected source. A troop of Mexican cavalry crested the rise, 30 men in uniform with rifles at ready. Not rurales, real soldiers, led by a captain Clara recognized from Santa Elena. Captain Delgado had bought horses from Dan, had his daughter's quinceañera dress sewn by Clara. He was also, as they'd learned, a man who'd lost his own family to raiders years ago. He understood something about finding new belonging. "Senor Pritchard," the captain called pleasantly, "you are causing disruption in my jurisdiction. These people are under the protection of Santa Elena." "I have legal papers," Pritchard began. "American papers. This is Mexico." Delgado's smile was sharp. "And I have witnesses who say you threatened our citizens, disrupted our peace. You will leave now, or I will arrest you for banditry." "You can't." "I can. I will. Choose quickly." Faced with 30 rifles and official opposition, Pritchard had no choice. But as he turned his horse, his ruined eye fixed on Clara with pure hatred. "This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll see you in hell first." "Probably," Clara agreed calmly. "But not today." The soldiers escorted Pritchard's group to the border, with clear instructions never to return. Captain Delgado lingered, studying their small, battered family. "You cannot return to Santa Elena," he said regretfully. "That man's gold will eventually talk louder than my rifles, but—" He handed Dan a sealed paper. "I have a cousin in Veracruz, a shipping merchant. He needs honest workers and asks no questions. The coast is far from here, far from borders and bitter men." Clara's throat tightened with gratitude. "Why help us?" "Because I have eyes." Delgado said simply, "I see how you are together. Love like that." He shrugged. "It should have a chance to grow old and peaceful." They parted with handshakes and mutual respect. As the soldiers rode away, Clara, Dan, and Jesse sat in the dust of their almost last battlefield, considering the future. "Veracruz," Jesse said thoughtfully. "I could learn ships, see the ocean." Dan's hands moved. "New life, new chances." "Together," Clara added, completing what had become their oath. They turned their tired horses south once more, toward the coast and possibility. Behind them, the desert held their footprints briefly before wind erased them. Ahead, somewhere beyond the horizon, waited a place where 3 souls might finally rest. Clara began to hum as they rode. Not a lullaby or hymn, but a working song she'd heard the vaqueros sing. Jesse joined in with the words, his voice cracking between boy and man. Dan added his rough harmony, no longer ashamed of his broken voice. They were battered, exhausted, forever marked by their trials, but they were alive and free and together. In this hard world, it was more than enough. It was everything. The sun descended toward evening, painting their shadows long across the patient earth. Somewhere ahead, the ocean waited with its own promises. And somewhere behind, a scarred man nursed hatred that might follow them forever. But for now, for this moment, they rode in peace, a strange family born of chance and choice, tested by fire and hatred, proven by loyalty that ran deeper than blood. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would meet it as they'd met today, united, unbowed, and unashamed of the love that made them whole. The cave was their sanctuary for 3 days, carved by ancient waters into the hillside 20 miles from where they'd lost Pritchard's men. Dan's shoulder wound seeped steadily despite Clara's best efforts with their meager supplies. The bullet had passed through cleanly, but infection threatened in the humid coastal heat. Jesse kept watch at the cave mouth, his young face etched with worry. "Riders went past again," he reported quietly. "Same 4 from yesterday, still searching the valleys." Clara didn't respond, focused on cleaning Dan's wound with the last of their boiled water. His skin burned with fever, and she'd seen him suppress groans when he thought she wasn't looking. The strong man who'd carried them so far now lay vulnerable under her hands. "We need supplies," she said finally. "Medicine, clean bandages, food. I'll go." Jesse volunteered immediately. "There's a village." "No." Clara's voice was firm. "They're looking for a boy and a woman with an Apache man. You'd be recognized." "Then what?" Clara made a decision that would have horrified her proper Eastern self. "I go alone, as someone else." An hour later, a Mexican peasant woman emerged from the caves. Her face darkened with dirt and berries. Her posture stooped with assumed age. Clara had traded her American dress for a rough serape taken from their supplies, her light hair hidden beneath a dark shawl. She'd learned enough Spanish from their months in Santa Elena to pass, if she kept her words simple and her eyes down. The village market bustled with morning trade. Clara shuffled between stalls, purchasing what they needed with careful coins: willow bark for fever, clean cloth, dried meat, cornmeal. She listened without seeming to, gathering gossip like gathering herbs. "The American still searches," one woman said to another. "Offers gold for word of the white woman who lives with savages. Shameless," her companion agreed, "but also dangerous. My husband saw what remained of Manuel's farm, burned because he wouldn't say which way they rode." Clara's hands trembled as she counted out pesos for tortillas. Pritchard was destroying innocent lives in his pursuit. How many would suffer because she'd chosen love over propriety? She almost made it out clean, but at the edge of the market, a familiar voice froze her blood. "You're certain you've seen no strangers?" "Old woman," one of Pritchard's men, questioning vendors. Clara hunched deeper into her disguise, shuffling past with her laden basket. The man's eyes swept over her dismissively. Just another poor Mexican woman, beneath notice. But as she passed, wind caught her shawl. Just for a moment, a strand of light hair escaped. The man's head snapped around, but Clara was already moving, forcing herself to maintain the painful shuffle despite every instinct screaming to run. She felt his eyes boring into her back all the way to the village edge. Only when hidden by jungle did she abandon pretense, hiking hard toward the cave, behind her. No pursuit sounded yet, but time was running short. Dan's fever had worsened in her absence. He thrashed in delirium, speaking brokenly in Apache, names of the dead, fragments of prayer, and her name repeated like a talisman. "Clara, stay. Clara." "I'm here," she soothed, mixing willow bark tea with desperate hands. "I'm staying." Jesse helped her force the medicine between Dan's lips. The boy had grown so much in their time together, but fear made him look young again. "He's strong," Jesse whispered, as if saying it could make it true. "Strongest man I know." "Yes," Clara agreed, "but even strong men need time to heal, time we don't have." They spent a sleepless night fighting Dan's fever. Clara bathed his burning skin, while Jesse sang Apache healing songs learned from his mother, whether from medicine, prayer, or pure stubborn will. The fever finally broke near dawn. Dan's eyes opened, focused and aware. "Clara," he managed, voice rough as sandstone. "Rest," she ordered, weak with relief. "Save your strength." But Dan struggled upright, gesturing urgently. His signs were clumsy with weakness, but clear enough. "Danger. Must move. Now." Jesse scrambled to the cave mouth, returning white-faced. Smoke, coming from the village. Clara's heart sank. Pritchard was burning again, punishing those who might have helped them. Soon he'd expand his search to the hills. The cave that had sheltered them would become a trap. Supporting Dan between them, they abandoned their sanctuary. Every step clearly pained him, but he made no sound. They moved deeper into the jungle, following game trails Jesse spotted with his keen eyes. Behind them, smoke columns rose like accusations against the morning sky. By noon, Dan could go no further. They made a rough camp by a stream, hidden beneath giant ferns. Clara redressed his wound, relieved to see it looked cleaner. But they had perhaps 2 days of supplies, and Dan needed weeks to properly heal. "I could steal a boat," Jesse suggested. "We follow the coast to Veracruz." A branch snapped. All three froze, hands moving to weapons. But instead of Pritchard's men, a small figure emerged from the green shadows. A Mexican girl, perhaps 12, with serious dark eyes. "You are the ones the bad man seeks," she said in accented English. "The teacher and the silent warrior and the boy who speaks 2 tongues. Clara tensed, but the girl raised empty hands. "I am Rosa. My grandmother says come. She has medicine, shelter." The burned village was her sister's. "Why would she help us?" Clara asked suspiciously. "Because the bad man burned her sister's home. Because you bought medicine for the fever sickness last winter in Santa Elena. Because—" Rosa shrugged with eloquent simplicity. "It is right." They had little choice. Dan needed better care than Clara could provide in the jungle, following Rosa through paths invisible to outsider eyes. They traveled deeper into green shadows until the girl stopped at what looked like an impenetrable wall of vines. Rosa whistled, 3 notes like a bird call. The vines parted, revealing a narrow passage. Beyond lay a hidden valley, a cluster of simple homes surrounded by gardens. And standing in the entrance, an ancient woman with eyes like Rosa's but holding decades more steel. "So," the grandmother said in English, "you are the ones who let love make them outlaws." She studied them with uncomfortable intensity. "Good. Outlaws for love, I understand. Come, we waste daylight." The hidden village took them in without question. Dan was installed in a clean bed, his wound properly treated with medicines Clara didn't recognize, but which reduced his fever within hours. Jesse found himself adopted by a pack of village children who treated his mixed heritage as fascinating rather than shameful. And Clara found herself sitting with the grandmother, learning. "This place," the old woman explained, "exists for those the world rejects. Runaway slaves, Yaqui fleeing war, Mexicans to Indian, Indians to Mexican, now Americans to Apache." She smiled. "The jungle hides many secrets." "How long have you been here?" "My whole life. My mother's life. Her mother's." The grandmother's hands never stilled, grinding herbs with practiced efficiency. "The Spanish never found us. The French never found us. Mexico City pretends we don't exist. And men like your hunter, they see only what they expect." Clara spent days learning the village ways while Dan recovered. These people had created their own world. Neither Mexican nor Indian nor anything the outside could categorize. They grew their own food, made their own laws, lived by their own customs. It was, she realized, what she and Dan and Jesse had been seeking, a place where being together was enough. Dan's strength returned slowly but surely. Clara would find him sitting with the village men, communicating in gestures and shared work. His silence, which might have set him apart elsewhere, meant nothing here. Half the village spoke languages the others didn't understand. They'd learned to communicate in deeper ways. Jesse thrived, his natural brightness emerging fully for the first time. He helped teach the younger children, sharing English and Apache words while learning the local dialect. Watching him, Clara felt her heart could burst with pride. One evening, as tropical birds sang their sunset chorus, Dan found her by the stream. His wound had healed to an angry scar, but he moved without pain. They sat together on smooth stones, watching water that ran clear as sky. "The grandmother says we could stay," Clara said eventually. "Build a house, make a life, be safe." Dan nodded, but his eyes asked a question. "I know," Clara sighed. "It feels like hiding. And Jesse, he's young. He should see more of the world than hidden valleys, no matter how peaceful." Dan's hand found hers, thumb tracing circles on her palm. They'd grown even closer during his recovery, the careful walls between them finally fallen. She'd held him through fever dreams, and he'd shown her his scars, not just physical, but the ones carried inside. Without words, they'd promised each other everything. "Tomorrow, the grandmother says traders come," Clara continued. "River people who ask no questions. They could take us to Veracruz." to Captain Delgado's cousin, to ships and possibilities. Dan squeezed her hand gently. The choice, his touch said, was hers too. Their decisions were made together now. That night, the village held council. Jesse translated as elders debated their fate. Some argued for them to stay. They'd brought no trouble that wasn't already coming, and the community could use their skills. Others worried about Pritchard's persistence, his willingness to burn the innocent. Finally, the grandmother spoke. They are like seeds blown on storm winds. They may root here or they may fly further, but wherever they land, they carry something precious, proof that love crosses all borders meant to divide us. She looked at Clara directly. The choice is yours, but know you will always have sanctuary here. Clara stood, feeling Dan and Jesse flank her, her family, strange and perfect. We're grateful beyond words, but Jesse deserves to see the ocean, to choose his own path with full knowledge of the world. And she glanced at Dan. We need to stop running towards something instead of just away. The village understood. They were given supplies, blessings, and careful directions. At dawn, they would meet the river traders and begin the next stage of their journey. But peace, as always, proved fragile. Near midnight, a runner arrived. Pritchard's men had found the first hidden trail. They'd be at the valley by morning, following tracks, asking questions with gold and guns. Go now, the grandmother commanded. We will give them false trails to follow, but go. Hurried farewells, promises to return someday. Children awakened to hug Jesse goodbye. Within an hour, they were gliding down the dark river in a narrow boat, the village already fading into jungle shadow behind them. Dan paddled silently while Clara held Jesse, who wept without shame for the friends lost to necessity. She understood. Every safe place eventually became unsafe. Every home proved temporary. But the three of them, that was permanent. That was home. The river wound toward the coast, carrying them through darkness toward another uncertain dawn. Behind them, perhaps Pritchard raged at another escape. Ahead waited Vera Cruz and ships to anywhere. I'm tired of running, Jesse said quietly. I know, my heart, Clara murmured. Maybe we won't have to much longer. Dan's steady paddle strokes paused. In the moonlight, she saw him touch his throat, preparing for the pain of speech. We stop running when we choose to fight. The words came broken but clear. Clara felt their truth settle into her bones. They'd fled across deserts and mountains, through jungles and rivers. But running only worked if somewhere, eventually, you turned to face what chased you. Not yet, she said. Jesse needs to be older, stronger, but yes, someday we stop running. Dan nodded and returned to paddling. Jesse straightened in her arms, young spine finding steel. They'd planted a seed with those words. Someday, they would water it with action. For now, the river carried them toward the coast. Stars wheeled overhead, indifferent to human struggles below. But Clara drew comfort from their steady light. Same stars over Ohio farmland, over Arizona desert, over Mexican jungle, under them all. She'd learned the same lesson. Home wasn't a place, but a choice, renewed daily, to face the world together. The boat slipped between dark banks, carrying its small cargo of love and determination toward whatever dawn would bring. And in the shadows behind, a hunter nursed his hatred, never knowing his quarry had already won by refusing to let pursuit define them. They were more than what they fled from. They were what they fled toward, each other, always, against whatever odds the world might offer. Vera Cruz sprawled before them like a promise, its harbor crowded with ships from every corner of the world. After 2 years of running, Clara barely recognized the woman who stared back from the cracked mirror in their rented room, sun-darkened, lean as rawhide. Eyes that had seen too much but somehow still held hope. Today, she said quietly, today we end this. Dan sat sharpening his knife with methodical strokes, his face carved from stone. Jesse, now 13 and tall for his age, cleaned their rifles with practiced efficiency. They'd lived peacefully here for 3 months, working for Captain Delgado's cousin, planning for passage to South America. But news had arrived with yesterday's ship. Pritchard was coming. He'd traced them at last to this final refuge. "We could still take ship," Jesse suggested without conviction. "Leave before—" "No." Clara's voice held iron. "Your words in the jungle were true. Dan, we stop running when we choose to fight. I choose now." Dan nodded slowly, signing, "Together." They'd prepared for this day without speaking of it. Jesse's shooting had become deadly accurate under Dan's tutelage. Clara had learned to fight with more than guns. The widow who ran the boarding house had taught her things about knives that would have horrified her proper Eastern self. And Dan had always been dangerous. Now he had even more to protect. Clara penned a letter with steady hands. "Mr. Pritchard, by the time you read this, I will be waiting at the old Mission San Salvador, 5 miles north of the city. Come alone if you have any honor left. Bring witnesses if you must. But let us end this between us, without innocents suffering for your pride. Siwa W." She paid a street child to deliver it to the hotel where Pritchard's arrival had been reported. Then they armed themselves and rode out before doubt could creep in. The mission stood in ruins, abandoned to jungle decades ago. Its courtyard provided clear sight lines, no chance for ambush by either side. They positioned themselves carefully. Jesse high in the crumbling bell tower with his rifle, Dan flanking the main entrance. Clara stood in the center, visible and vulnerable, bait for the trap that wasn't quite a trap. Pritchard arrived at sunset, and he hadn't come alone. 20 men spread behind him, hard cases hired from the docks. He himself looked diminished, the scar pulling his face into a permanent sneer, his fine clothes hanging loose on a frame worn by obsession. "Mrs. Pritchard," he called mockingly. "How thoughtful of you to surrender at last." "I'm not surrendering." Clara replied clearly. "I'm offering you a choice. Turn around. Leave Mexico. Live your life free of this poisonous need for revenge. Or—" she gestured to the ruins around them. "We settle this here." "Settle?" Pritchard laughed, ugly and sharp. "You destroyed my reputation. My business collapsed when word spread that my mail-order bride chose savages over me. You took my eye, my pride, my life." His voice rose to near shriek. "The only settlement is your return or your death. Then you've chosen." Clara's signal was dropping to one knee. Jesse's first shot took the hat off Pritchard's lieutenant, a warning still, even now. Dan materialized from shadow, his rifle speaking twice. 2 men fell, clutching shoulders. "Stop!" Clara commanded before chaos could erupt. "Those were warning shots. The next won't be. You have 10 seconds to decide. Leave or die in these ruins." Pritchard's men looked uncertain. They'd been hired to retrieve a woman, not face a fortified position defended by skilled fighters. But Pritchard himself seemed beyond reason, foam flecking his lips. "Take them!" he screamed. 100 gold pieces to whoever brings me her head." The battle erupted in earnest. Jesse's rifle cracked steadily from above, his young voice counting in Apache between shots, keeping himself calm as Dan had taught him. Dan moved like smoke through the ruins, appearing just long enough to fire before vanishing. Clara held the center, her revolvers steady, defending their position with desperate accuracy. But 20 against 3 couldn't last. Pritchard's men were dock scum but not cowards, and gold spoke loudly. They pressed forward, using cover, coordinating their advance. Clara felt the circle tightening. That's when the impossible happened. From the jungle emerged more figures, the hidden villagers they'd stayed with, led by Rosa and her grandmother. Then Captain Delgado's cousin with dock workers who'd become friends, the padre from Jesse's school, leading a group of mission Indians who'd decided the Apache boy and his strange family deserved protection. "You are not alone," Rosa shouted in English, firing an ancient musket with determination if not accuracy. The tide turned. Faced with a small army defending the ruins, Pritchard's mercenaries began melting away. Gold was good, but not worth dying for in a foreign land. Within minutes, only Pritchard and 3 loyalists remained, backed against the mission wall. "It's over," Clara said, approaching slowly. "You've lost?" "Never." Pritchard drew a hidden derringer, aiming at her heart. "If I can't have you, no one—" 3 shots rang as one. Jesse from the tower, Dan from the side, and Clara from straight on. Pritchard crumpled, looking more surprised than pained. The derringer fell from nerveless fingers. Clara knelt beside him, feeling for wounds. He'd live. They'd all aim to wound, not kill, even now, after everything. She couldn't murder him in cold blood. "Why?" Pritchard whispered, genuine confusion in his remaining eye. "I offered you everything, respectability, comfort, position. You offered me a cage." Clara replied gently, "I chose freedom. With savages, degrading yourself." Clara looked up at Dan, standing protective behind her, at Jesse, scrambling down from the tower with concern written across his young face, at the villagers and townspeople who'd risked themselves for strangers who'd become family. "I chose love," she said simply. "Real love. The kind that sees truly and chooses anyway. The kind that builds rather than owns. You could never understand that." Pritchard's men carried him away, defeated in body and spirit. Captain Delgado's cousin had connections. Pritchard would be on the next ship north, with clear understanding that returning meant a noose. The long chase was over. As the crowd dispersed with congratulations and relief, Clara found herself shaking. Dan's arms came around her, solid and real. Jesse pressed against her other side. "Is it really done?" the boy asked. "Yes," Clara said, though she could hardly believe it herself. "We're free." They returned to town as heroes of sorts. The story spread. The woman who'd fought for her right to choose, the silent Apache who'd protected them, the boy who'd bridged 2 worlds. It was a story that would grow in telling, becoming legend along the coast. That night, in their small room overlooking the harbor, they held council. "We could stay," Jesse said hopefully. "People accept us here. I could finish school, maybe become a teacher myself, or we could take ship." Clara suggested, "See those far places we've dreamed of? South America, the Pacific Islands, somewhere no one knows our story." Dan signed slowly. "What do you want?" It was the essential question. What did she want, now that running was no longer necessary? Clara looked at her small, fierce family and found her answer. "I want a home," she said. "Not just a hiding place, but a home. Somewhere Jesse can grow into the man he's meant to be. Somewhere we can live without weapons always at hand. Somewhere we can just be." Dan smiled, that rare, transformative expression. He pointed to the floor. "Here?" Clara considered. Vera Cruz had welcomed them. Jesse had friends, school, a future. They had work, respect, community. It wasn't the life she'd imagined boarding that train in Ohio so long ago. It was infinitely better. "Here," she agreed. Jesse whooped, dancing around the small room. Even Dan's reserve cracked enough for quiet laughter. They'd found it at last. Not just safety, but belonging. Later, as Jesse slept and Dan kept his habitual watch by the window, Clara stood on their small balcony. The harbor lights reflected off dark water like scattered stars. Ships came and went, carrying dreams and seekers to distant shores. But she no longer envied them. Her journey was complete. "Clara," Dan's voice, still rough but stronger with practice. "Wife." She turned, finding him holding out a simple silver ring. Not fancy, probably traded for rather than bought, but perfect in its simplicity. "Yes," she said, no hesitation. "Husband." He slipped the ring onto her finger with reverent care. They'd been married in every way that mattered for months, but this was for the world to see. No more questions about their relationship, no more assumptions or insults. Just truth, acknowledged. They were married by the padre the next week, Jesse standing as witness, half the port district crowding the small church. Clara wore her Apache dress, Dan's sister's gift, now truly hers. Dan spoke his vows in careful, painful words that brought tears to every eye. Jesse translated the Apache blessings he added, while Rosa's grandmother contributed her own in the old tongue of the hidden village. It was a wedding like no other, a white woman and an Apache man, blessed in Spanish, English, and languages most didn't recognize, but it was real and legal and recognized. No one could question their right to be together now. The years would bring their own challenges. Jesse would indeed become a teacher, bridging worlds with the wisdom learned from his strange upbringing. Dan would find his voice slowly returning, though he'd always speak more with actions than words. Clara would become a fixture of the port, the American woman who chose her own path and defended it with lead and love. They'd have children, 2 daughters with Dan's dark eyes and Clara's stubborn chin. The girls would grow up speaking 3 languages, knowing their heritage included Ohio farms and Apache mountains, Mexican jungles and hidden villages. They'd never question their right to exist, to be loved, to choose their own paths. But that was all to come. For now, Clara stood in the mission courtyard where violence had finally ended. Dan's hand warm in hers, Jesse chattering excitedly about school projects. The old stones had seen conquest and abandonment, prayer and battle. Now they witnessed something rarer, a family forged by choice, tested by fire, and finally, blessedly, at peace. Home, Clara said, testing the word. Home. Dan agreed, the word clear despite its roughness. Home, Jesse confirmed, young voice certain. Above them, stars emerged one by one in the darkening sky. Same stars that had witnessed their flight across deserts, their desperate loves in shadow, their refusal to let the world define them. Now those stars saw them standing free, together, unafraid. The night wind carried salt and promise from the harbor. Ships would sail with tomorrow's tide, carrying adventurers toward horizons unknown. But Clara, Dan, and Jesse would wake in their small room overlooking the water, no longer running toward tomorrow, but living fully in today. They'd chosen each other against all odds, all opposition, all sense. And in that choosing, they'd found the only home that truly mattered, the one built from love, defended with courage, and inhabited by hearts that refused to accept any bonds but those they forged themselves. The mission bells had long since fallen, but Clara could swear she heard them ringing, not for what was lost, but for what was found, not for what ended, but for what could finally, truly begin. The ranch land stretched golden beneath the Sonoran sun, 20 acres of promise bordered by mountains that held their shadows like old friends. Clara stood at the gate, her daughters playing in the dust at her feet. Maria, age 4, dark and serious like her father, and Sophie, barely 2, with Clara's stubborn chin and Dan's gentle eyes. Home, Dan said beside her, the word coming easier now after years of practice. His voice would never be smooth, but it carried love in every rough note. It had taken them 5 years of saving, working the Vera Cruz docks and taking in sewing, teaching and translating, but they'd done it, their own land, bought fair and legal, far enough from any town to live in peace, but close enough to trade. The ranch came with a small adobe house and a well that never ran dry, paradise after so many temporary shelters. Jesse rode up on his paint mare, no longer the skinny boy from the desert, but a young man of 18, tall and confident. He taught at the mission school 3 days a week, returning home to help with the ranch on weekends. His students, Apache, Mexican, and mixed-blood children like himself, adored him for understanding their struggles with belonging. Mama Clara, he called, still using the childhood name. Letter from town, from Ohio. Clara's heart stuttered. She'd written to her cousin months ago, the first contact with her old life since boarding that fateful train. Taking the letter with trembling hands, she read quickly, then slowly again. What news? Dan asked, reading her expression with practiced ease. My cousin Sarah, she's coming to visit, with her husband. They want to see how I'm living. Clara looked up at her family, her Apache husband with silver threading his long hair, her mixed-blood son grown tall and proud, her daughters brown as desert earth. She says the family has wondered, worried. Jesse dismounted, concern creasing his features. Will they understand? It was the eternal question. Would her blood family understand the family she'd chosen? Would they see love where others saw only scandal? Only one way to know. Clara decided. We invite them. Show them our truth. The preparations took weeks. Not to hide who they were, Clara refused to do that, but to make their home welcoming to visitors who'd traveled so far. Maria helped her mother cook, standing on a box to reach the table, chattering in the mix of English, Apache and Spanish that was their household tongue. Sophie toddled after Dan, mimicking his movements as he repaired fences and gentled horses. Sarah arrived on a Thursday, dust-covered from the stage journey, her husband Thomas quiet beside her. Clara saw her cousin's eyes widen at Dan's appearance, at Jesse's easy familiarity, at the children who ran to their mother calling Mama in 3 languages. Clara, Sarah said faintly. You look different, Clara suggested, embracing her cousin. I am different. Come, let me show you my life. The first days were awkward. Sarah jumped when Dan moved too suddenly, stared when Jessie spoke Apache to the girls, pressed her lips thin when neighbors visited. Mexican ranchers, Apache traders, the mixed families who formed their community. Thomas said little, watching everything with thoughtful eyes. But children have a way of breaking down walls. Sophie climbed into Sarah's lap during dinner, offering her a beloved corn-husked doll with solemn generosity. Maria showed off her letters, carefully traced under Jessie's tutelage, and slowly, meal by meal. Sarah's reserve cracked. He loves you, she said one evening, watching Dan teach Maria to braid horsehair. It's obvious in every look. Yes, Clara said simply, and I love him, more than I thought possible. But the difficulties are worth it. Clara touched her cousin's hand. Sarah, I was dying inside, following the path set for me. This life, these people, they saved me, gave me purpose, gave me joy. Sarah was quiet long moments. Then, Mother would have been horrified. Yes, Father would have disowned you. Probably. And Sarah's voice broke slightly. I'm proud of you for choosing love over ease, for building this beautiful, impossible family. They embraced then, cousins reconnecting across years and choices. Thomas, who had been silent throughout the visit, finally spoke at dinner that night. I fought in the war, he said quietly. Saw things, did things, came home broken inside. He looked at Dan with understanding. Sometimes the people who save us aren't the ones others expect. Sometimes salvation comes in forms the world calls wrong. He raised his glass. 2 unexpected families. 2 unexpected families. They echoed, even little Sophie attempting the words. Sarah stayed 3 weeks, learning their rhythms. She helped Clara tend the garden, growing vegetables that thrived in desert soil. She watched Jesse teach, seeing how he made each child feel valued regardless of their heritage. She saw Dan's gentleness with his daughters, his wordless communication with Clara that spoke volumes. On her last night, they sat outside watching stars emerge. The girls slept in Sarah's lap. They'd claimed her as Aunt Sarah within days, winning her heart completely. I'll tell them, Sarah said softly. The family back home. I'll tell them you're happy, that you're loved, that your children are beautiful and bright. Some won't understand, but some will. That's all I can ask. Clara replied. The goodbye was tearful, with promises to write, to visit again. As the stage pulled away, Clara felt a chapter closing. Not with her past, that would always be part of her, but with the need for that past's approval. You good? Dan asked, his English improving yearly, though he'd always prefer Apache or silence. I'm good, Clara assured him. I'm home. The ranch prospered. Their small herd of cattle grew. Jesse graduated from teacher to running his own school. Revolutionary in its inclusion, Maria showed signs of her father's gift with horses, while Sophie demonstrated her mother's iron will in all things. There were challenges still. Cowboys passing through sometimes made comments about Dan, about their family. There were towns they couldn't safely visit, places their daughters might not be welcome, but here on their land, surrounded by others who understood mixed families and chosen bonds, they thrived. One sunset. As Clara worked on the ranch's books, she'd learned numbers from necessity. Dan approached with something hidden behind his back. "Close eyes," he instructed. Clara obeyed, smiling at his mysterious tone. She felt him place something in her hands, a wooden box, carved with delicate precision. "Look now." Inside lay a necklace of silver and turquoise, Apache traditional work but with a modern touch. At its center hung a small charm, 3 intertwined circles. "Jesse helped design," Dan explained. 3 circles, you, me, him, beginning. Now bigger family, but we 3 start it all. Clara's throat closed with emotion. "It's perfect." He fastened it around her neck with careful hands. "You wear it gathering next month. Show everyone." The gathering was an annual event, bringing together the scattered families like theirs, the mixed, the different, the ones who'd made their own paths. It had started small but grown as word spread, a place where Apache Mexican couples could dance without stares, where white women married to Indian men could share recipes and stories, where children of all mixtures could play without learning shame. Clara wore the necklace proudly as they hosted their portion of the gathering. Their ranch had become a regular stop, their story inspiration for others facing similar choices. "Tell it again, Mama," Maria begged that night as families camped across their land. "Tell how you met Papa." So Clara told it, as she had many times, the scared woman at the train station, the silent warrior and frightened boy, the choice to stay together against all odds. Other families shared their own stories. Love found in unlikely places, prejudice overcome. Communities built from courage. Jesse translated for those who needed it, moving easily between languages and worlds. At 20 now, several young women watched him with interest, but he seemed in no hurry to choose. "I'm waiting for lightning," he told Clara. "Like you and Dan had, the kind that changes everything." "Lightning's not always comfortable," Clara warned. "Neither is settling for less," Jesse replied with wisdom beyond his years. As the gathering wound down, an old Apache man approached Clara. He'd traveled far to attend, heard stories of the white woman who'd chosen the Apache way. "You have something," he said in careful English. "That many lose. You have the old strength and the new wisdom. Your daughters will need both." He blessed the girls in Apache, blessed their union, blessed their land. It felt like acceptance from ancestors Dan couldn't claim aloud. His family gone, his clan scattered. But here, building new traditions from old wisdom, they'd found belonging again. The years would continue bringing changes. The frontier was settling, becoming less wild. Laws were changing, slowly, about marriages like theirs. The world their daughters would inherit would be different from the one that had tried to tear their parents apart. But that night, with stars wheeling overhead and their land full of chosen family, Clara felt the perfect rightness of her path. Every hard mile, every dangerous moment, every tear shed for the price of choosing love, all had led here. Dan's arms came around her from behind, solid and sure. Jesse sat nearby, playing guitar and singing in 3 languages for an enchanted audience. Maria and Sophie danced with the other children, free and unashamed of who they were. "No regrets?" Dan asked in her ear. "Never," Clara answered. "Not one." She thought of the woman on the train platform, abandoned and afraid. That Clara could never have imagined this. Land of her own, a love that deepened daily. Children who carried multiple worlds in their small bodies. A community that celebrated difference rather than feared it. The fire crackled, sending sparks toward heaven. Someone started a song everyone knew, and voices rose in harmony. Apache and Mexican, English and Spanish, all blending into something new and beautiful. Clara sang along, her necklace warm against her throat, her family around her, her home secure beneath her feet. She traveled so far from that Ohio farm, through desert and mountain, through fear and violence, to arrive at this moment of grace. Tomorrow would bring its own challenges. The world wasn't done testing those who chose love over convention. But tonight, in the circle of firelight with her impossible, beautiful family, Clara knew one truth absolute. She was exactly where she belonged. Jesse finished his song to applause and calls for more. Dan pressed a kiss to Clara's temple. The girls ran to their parents, faces bright with joy and marshmallow. And overhead, the same stars that had witnessed their desperate flight now blessed their triumphant peace. Home, family, freedom, love. In the end, what more could anyone ask of life? Thank you for joining me on this wild journey through the American frontier. If you're listening to this story, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from. Drop a comment below and let's connect. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more tales of courage, love, and adventure from the Old West. Share your thoughts about Clara, Dan, and Jesse's story. What touched your heart? What surprised you? Your comments mean the world to me, and who knows, they might inspire the next tale. Until we meet again on the dusty trails of story time. Partners.